He brought his daughter to work because there was nowhere else to go. He got fired, in front of everyone. No one spoke up for him. No one stopped it. But what he didn't know was that someone else had been watching. A woman in the corner. A memory in her heart. And a sentence that would change everything. I was that kid. This is the story behind the title you clicked. A single dad was fired for bringing his girl until his new boss walked in and said, I was that kid. If stories of kindness, quiet strength, and second chances speak to your heart, you're in the right place. Take a deep breath. And let's begin. The rain had started sometime before dawn, a thin, persistent drizzle that blanketed the city in gray and seeped through everything: coats, plans, hopes. David Torres pressed the back of his hand to his daughter's forehead again as they sat in the front seat of his aging pickup, parked 2 blocks from the towering glass building of Callahan Frost Financial. Lena stirred beneath her oversized hoodie. Her cheeks flushed, her breathing a soft rasp in the still air. She's warm, he whispered, mostly to himself. Too warm. He looked at the time on his cracked phone, 7:38 a.m. If he didn't clock in by 7:55, he'd lose the shift. And losing one more shift meant losing everything. His contract with the building's maintenance vendor was already hanging by a thread. No PTO, no sick leave, no union. Just a clipboard, a tool belt, and the mercy of whoever reviewed his weekly hours. David looked at Lena again, her legs curled under her. She opened her eyes slightly. Daddy, do I have to go to school? Not today, sweetheart, he said, forcing a smile. We're doing a quiet day. He made a decision. David scooped her into his arms, wrapped her tightly in his faded work jacket, and slipped out of the truck. The cold rain tapped against their shoulders as he jogged across the street, through the underground delivery bay, and into the rear service entrance of the building. Inside it was warm and sterile, bright lights, white floors, the scent of lemon cleaner, and ambition. He nodded politely to the security guard who barely looked up. He carried Lena past the boiler room, past the janitorial lockers, and into storage room 3B, a forgotten closet behind the electrical panel. Stay here, baby, he whispered, laying her on a folded moving blanket. He handed her a thermos of warm water and a half banana. I'll be just outside. I'll check on you every break. Lena nodded sleepily. I like it when you're close. I'm not going anywhere. He kissed her forehead and stepped out, closing the door gently behind him. By 9:15, David was up on the 19th floor adjusting an elevator panel that had been glitching for days. He worked quickly, silently, just like he always did. Efficient, invisible, disposable. At 9:27, he got the text that would detonate his day. Torres, come to conference room A, immediately. Leticia Flores, director of HR. His stomach dropped. Had someone seen him bring Lena in cameras? A complaint? He wiped his hands, smoothed his jacket, and rode the elevator down, each ding echoing like a countdown. When he stepped into the glass-walled conference room, every head turned. Leticia sat at the far end of the polished table spine, ramrod straight eyes already narrowed like a verdict had been passed. Mr. Torres, she said coolly, why is your daughter in our building? David blinked. I didn't have anyone to watch her today. He began, heart-thudding. She's sick. I couldn't leave her home alone. Leticia's voice sliced through his explanation like glass. This is not a daycare. Our company policy strictly prohibits unauthorized personnel on site, especially children. A few team leads sat along the wall, clearly uncomfortable, but no one spoke. She's not a danger, David said softly. She's just resting. I only needed to finish today's shift policy, Leticia said, is not a suggestion. You are in breach of security protocol. You are terminated effective immediately. The words landed like a slap. David opened his mouth, closed it again. No one looked at him. No one offered a word. Only the hum of the lights and the gentle tap of rain on the glass walls filled the silence. Leticia stood. You may collect your things. Security will escort you out. David nodded slowly. He turned and walked away, each step echoing louder than the last. As he exited the conference room, a movement caught his eye. A woman, unfamiliar but striking, stood just outside in the hallway, half-shadowed by a marble pillar. She wore a tailored gray coat and held a closed umbrella in one hand. Her expression was unreadable. Her eyes followed him not with judgment but something else, something softer. She didn't say a word. David turned away and walked on. He found Lena where he'd left her, shivering slightly but awake. She looked up as he entered. "Are we going now?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. David crouched beside her, nodding. "Yeah, baby. We're leaving." In the rain, he forced a smile. "Rain's just sky hugs. We'll be fine." He bundled her up again, and together they stepped back into the freight corridor, through the service lobby, past the vending machines and the mechanical buzz of forgotten rooms. They exited through the side door. The rain had turned heavier, fat drops now slicing through the cold. David pulled his coat tighter around Lena, shielding her as best he could. "Mama used to sing when it rained," she mumbled, pressing her cheek against his chest. "I liked that." David blinked hard. "I know, sweetheart," he whispered. "I remember." As they reached the sidewalk, the street hummed with life people under umbrellas, rushing, clicking heels on wet pavement, not one of them slowing. He looked up, jaw clenched. Behind him, far above on the 20th floor, the woman in the gray coat stood at the window watching. Still silent, still unseen. David took a deep breath and turned away. "I'll find us something," he murmured. "I always do." He didn't see the umbrella in her hand tighten. He didn't see her step back from the glass. But she had seen everything. And she would not forget. The rain kept falling. Not in waves or thunderclaps, but in that relentless, whispering way that soaked a man's resolve, the same way it soaked his socks. David walked with Lena pressed against his chest beneath his coat, her damp hair clinging to his collarbone. She was warm, too warm, and still breathing with that wheezing rasp that never failed to make his heart clench. He kept his eyes low, avoiding the gazes of passing umbrellas, of suits and heels and high-speed lives that had no time for a man carrying a child with nowhere to go. They passed a diner. A red neon sign blinked "Open 24/7, flickering like a last-chance heartbeat. David stepped inside, not for food, not yet, but for a moment out of the wet. The hostess gave him a tight smile. She looked at Lena, then back at him. "We're full, sir." Half the booths were empty. David nodded anyway. "Can I just stand here a moment to warm her up? We'll leave right after." She hesitated. 5 minutes. No longer. He whispered a thank you and sat at the edge of a booth, rubbing Lena's back. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes fluttered open, glazed but alert. "I like the smell in here," she said, her voice no louder than a paper scratch. He smiled. "Smells like pancakes and dreams." A soft chuckle escaped her, dry and thin. Then, like a match gone out, her eyes closed again. David turned to the window, staring out at the traffic light blinking red across the misty glass. He didn't notice the woman entering the cafe behind him. She wore a gray wool coat, her umbrella dripping quietly into the holder by the door. She didn't speak, just watched. Waited. When the server came over with a small to-go bag, she pointed discreetly at the pair in the booth. For them, she whispered, "Don't say who." Inside the bag, a grilled cheese sandwich still warm, a bottle of apple juice, and a note scribbled on a napkin. "For the little fighter. Stay warm today." The server handed it to David awkwardly. "Someone left this at the counter. Must have seen your kid." David blinked, surprised. "Are you sure I'm just the messenger?" He opened the bag. Lena stirred, catching the smell. "Is that cheese?" "Looks like someone sent you magic," David said softly. "How lucky are we? I'm the luckiest." Lena mumbled, reaching for the juice. He watched her sip, her cheeks pinking ever so slightly. His throat tightened. Whoever had done this had seen them, cared, and that was more than most. They kept walking after that. The clouds didn't let up, but neither did David. He carried a manila folder of resumes, wrinkled, water-spotted, and truthfully a little desperate. Each line in it told a story that no one seemed willing to read. Facilities maintenance. 3 years electrical troubleshooting, certified team lead construction until 2020. But next to it in fine print on every form he filled, have you ever been terminated from a prior role? Yes. And the moment he checked that box, every polite smile turned tight. Every "we'll get back to you" became a silent door closing. They walked to a gas station where he'd seen a hiring sign the week before. The manager took one look at his soggy coat, the sleeping child in his arms, and sighed. "I don't hire people with family baggage," he said plainly. No offense. David didn't respond, just nodded. Understood. Back on the sidewalk, he tried not to let Lena feel the tension in his chest. She'd fallen asleep again, her body limp with exhaustion and fever. He adjusted her weight and pressed his lips to her temple. "We're gonna figure this out," he said. "I don't care how many no's we get." They found temporary refuge in a 24-hour laundromat. The place hummed with the sound of spinning dryers and the low buzz of fluorescent lights. David placed Lena on a bench and tucked his coat over her like a blanket. He sat beside her, head in hands, listening to the rain hit the metal awning outside. Then he heard it footsteps. Soft, deliberate. A woman passed by the window outside. He recognized her, or thought he did. It was hard to tell in the blur of motion and water. She didn't come in, just paused, looking through the glass at Lena at him, and then moved on. He stood up to follow, but hesitated. He couldn't leave Lena alone, and besides, why chase a stranger? He sat back down, and noticed something odd. Next to their bench on the small plastic table sat a box of tissues and a sealed bottle of children's cold medicine. David looked around. No one nearby. No sign of who'd left it. He picked it up. Brand new. Expiration date years ahead. He swallowed hard. An hour later, David found a shelter with a bench under a small overhang just off 3rd Street. He curled Lena into his lap, wrapping them both in what remained of his warmth. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I should have figured this out by now." Lena stirred. Her voice was faint but clear. "I like being with you better than any place, Daddy." Tears blurred his vision. Above them, high in a corner office of a building with no name on the door, the woman from earlier stood with her arms crossed, looking down through rain-streaked glass. She hadn't planned on seeing them again. But now that she had, she couldn't unsee them. And in the girl's wheeze, in the father's stubborn silence. She heard her own past breathing back at her. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind streets slick with yesterday's pain and today's stubborn promise. David sat at the edge of a picnic bench behind a public library, spreading out damp resumes across a plastic sleeve he'd borrowed from the job center bulletin board. He used the last of his napkin stash to blot the corners dry. His eyes scanned the page again. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't pretend, but it was honest. David Torres, skilled technician. Bilingual English, Spanish, punctual. No record. Father. That last word, father, wasn't on the resume, but it was in everything else. Behind him, Lena slept curled on the bench with her head resting on a folded sweater, still feverish, still wheezing softly. Her hair was matted in the back, her socks mismatched, but her tiny fingers still clutched a crumpled sketch of a house with windows and a chimney and 2 stick figures, one big one, small, both smiling. David looked over his shoulder just to be sure she was still breathing smoothly, then stood. He slipped 4 resumes into his backpack, zipped it shut, and walked 2 blocks to the nearest maintenance subcontractor's office. He rang the buzzer. A man in a ball cap opened the door and peered out. "Looking for work," David said quickly. "Any kind. Cleaning repair overnight. I've got experience license, too." The man took the paper, gave it one glance. "You worked for Rexton Facilities?" he asked, already beginning to fold it. 3 years, David said. "Fired last week. I brought my daughter to work. She was sick. No one to watch her." The man paused, frowned. "Yeah, that doesn't look great on a record. HR flags that sort of thing." David nodded. He wasn't surprised anymore, just tired. The man sighed, handed the resume back. Try Hartman Janitorial on the East Side. They sometimes take walk-ins. Good luck, man. He returned to the bench. Lena stirred as he sat, her voice a soft croak. Did we get it? David smiled gently. Not this one. She nodded and curled in closer. It's okay. We'll try the next. That simple trust undid him. He kissed the crown of her head, then reached for her inhaler. Nearly empty. They'd need a refill by tomorrow. He had $18 left. He stared across the parking lot toward the drugstore down the street. Behind it stood a narrow two-story building with a cracked sign that read, Solunas Rivera, Cleaning Services. A paper sign was taped crookedly in the window. Now hiring night staff. No diploma required. David hesitated. He looked at Lena, then back at the sign. He stood. The inside smelled of bleach dust and faint lemon. A narrow desk stood near the door, manned by a young receptionist chewing gum and typing slowly on an ancient keyboard. Application, David asked. She reached under the desk, handed him a form. Bathroom's down the hall if your kid needs it. David blinked. She's not with me right now. She shrugged. Most folks bring their kids here. It's fine long as they stay in the break room. Something in him eased. He sat on a plastic chair in the corner and began filling in the form. Name, David Torres Experience. 8 years electrical janitorial facilities. Previous employer, Rexton Facilities. Reason for leaving his pen hovered. He swallowed. Terminated brought child to sight. He filled it in slowly. Truth had its cost. But hiding hadn't done him much good either. He handed it in, thanked the girl, and walked back toward Lena. What he didn't see, behind a partially open office door on the second-floor mezzanine, a woman was watching. Again. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She just watched the man walk out into the daylight holding nothing but an empty water bottle and a quiet dignity that wrapped around him like armor. Later that afternoon, as David and Lena sat outside a convenience store sharing a warm bottle of Gatorade, his phone buzzed. He nearly dropped it. Mr. Torres, this is Elena from Solunas Rivera. Are you available to start tomorrow? His mouth opened, then closed. Yes, he said. Yes, absolutely. There's something else, Elena continued. We understand you may have your daughter with you at times. As long as she's in the break room and stays safe, that's allowed. Just keep her out of active work zones. David blinked, stunned. You're serious? Yes, sir. We're serious. We've been where you are. He hung up and turned to Lena, who was now sitting cross-legged on the pavement, drawing circles in the dust with a straw. We got the job, he said. She looked up, blinking. Her face cracked into a grin. We got it. We got it. He pulled her into his arms, spinning her once, carefully. She coughed in surprise, then laughed a high, breathy giggle that shook loose some of the heaviness in his chest. As they sat on the curb sharing the rest of the drink, a man in a gray van across the street pulled away. He was the supply driver for Solunas Rivera and had seen David there earlier. And in a corner office upstairs once again, the woman stood. The same one who had seen them in the rain. The cafe. The laundromat. But this time she wasn't watching with distance. This time she was taking notes. This time she was preparing to step closer. Not yet, but soon. Because some stories need time to unfold. And some kindnesses are best given when the person receiving them has proven they were never waiting to be rescued. David's first night on the job felt like stepping into a forgotten world. The building was old but functional, its polished floors whispering of long hours and small victories, its fluorescent lights flickering just enough to remind you nothing in life was perfect. The cleaning crew at Solunas Rivera operated like a quiet heartbeat after business hours, unseen but vital. And David, he fit right in. He wore his uniform like a second skin. Blue work shirt, name tag slightly crooked dark slacks too loose around the waist, he'd lost weight over the past weeks, though he hadn't noticed until he saw himself in the break room mirror. Lena sat curled on a beanbag chair in the corner, nibbling crackers, her blanket tucked around her like a shield. A donated tablet played gentle cartoons at low volume. She looked up every now and then, giving him a thumbs up as he walked past with a mop or empty trash bin. He worked fast, carefully, without complaint. He scrubbed floors, sanitized restrooms, vacuumed long corridors, and never once slowed unless it was to glance back at his daughter. That night, around 10:45 p.m., something unusual happened. He was buffing the hallway tiles on the executive level of floor they were only occasionally assigned when he heard the unmistakable click of high heels echoing down the hallway. He looked up, startled. A woman in a dark gray pantsuit turned the corner. Tall, confident, her face unreadable but familiar. Too familiar. He recognized her not just from a single moment, but from several. The blurred glimpses outside the diner, the laundromat window, even a faint memory of her near the park weeks ago. She had been there just at the edges. She stopped a few feet from him. "You cleaned this floor already?" she asked, voice cool but not cold. "Just finishing up, ma'am," he replied, moving the buffer aside. She nodded. "I've seen you before." He froze. She didn't smile, didn't soften, but she didn't look away either. "I'm Claire Hartwell," she said simply. "I oversee several of the companies we contract with." David's heart dropped. So this was someone important. Dangerous, maybe. The kind of person who had the power to give or take in a single sentence. "I hope everything's been satisfactory," he said carefully. Claire tilted her head. "You're not just a janitor." He blinked. "No, ma'am. Yes, I am. Right now I am." You weren't always," she said. "Your hands, your posture. You used to lead people. It wasn't a question." David nodded slowly. Facilities team lead, then a shift manager. Well, I got fired." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Why?" He hesitated, but something in her expression made him tell the truth. "My daughter had a fever. Daycare closed. No family. I brought her with me to work. I kept her safe. Didn't let her near any danger or equipment. But someone reported it, and they let you go. They didn't even ask why David said." His voice wasn't bitter, just worn. "Policy's policy." Claire was silent. The hallway buzzed softly with the electric hum of lights. "You didn't try to appeal?" she asked. He gave a dry smile. "Tried. But HR didn't care. I didn't have a voice that mattered." Claire looked past him down the hallway, then back again. "You do now," she said quietly. David frowned. "I'm sorry," but she didn't explain. Instead, she turned and walked away, her heels echoing like punctuation. That weekend, David worked a double shift. Lena's fever had broken, but her cough lingered, and he was saving for her next pediatric visit. They'd found a tiny sublet, a basement room in a retired teacher's home, who charged them less than market rent because the little girl reminds me of my granddaughter. It was small, damp, and not very pretty, but to Lena it was a castle. She drew a flower on the wall with her crayons and labeled it Home. David watched her sleep that night on a real mattress for the first time in weeks. He didn't cry, but his hands trembled when he reached to adjust her blanket. Monday morning came with unexpected news. At the end of his shift, the HR lead at Solunas Rivera handed him a sealed envelope. "Upper admin wants you to see this," she said. "No idea what it's about." David opened it cautiously. Inside was a simple letter. "Mr. Torres, your work has been noticed. We'd like to offer you a trial supervisory position overseeing the rotating night crews at 3 buildings, including the Hartwell Tech Center. This position includes benefits. We'd like to discuss more in person. C.H. Claire Hartwell." He sat on the edge of the bench in the break room, letter in hand, heart pounding. Lena looked up from her coloring book. "Is it a good letter?" David smiled, wide, unguarded, real. "It's a very good letter. But what David didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Claire had gone home that night after their conversation and pulled out a dusty box from her closet. Inside, an old employee badge from 1996, a janitor's uniform, a photo of her at 8 years old sitting behind a mop cart bundled in a coat too big for her tiny frame, and a letter from a former boss. You don't belong in the shadows. Find your light. She had carried that with her through every promotion, every sleepless night in boardrooms full of people who never knew her story, until she met someone who reminded her why she'd never forgotten it, and why maybe it was finally time to give someone else the chance she once so desperately needed. David stood outside the Hartwell Tech Center, the letter still folded in the inside pocket of his work jacket worn thin at the elbows. A drizzle freckled the pavement. Behind him, Lena twirled in her too big raincoat, pretending the building was a castle and she was a royal inspector there to check if the floors sparkled. "I'll be back soon, okay," he said, kneeling to her eye level. "You stay with Ms. Dolores in the break room. She's got snacks." Lena gave him a mock salute. "Yes, Captain." He couldn't help but smile. Every step forward lately felt like dragging a mountain with him, but Lena made it lighter. She always did. Inside the executive wing, David felt the difference immediately. Carpets thick enough to hush your doubts. Glass walls so clean they looked invisible. A receptionist with sharp eyeliner and sharper eyes offered him coffee. He declined. "Miss Hartwell will be with you shortly," she said. He nodded and waited on a leather couch that probably cost more than his entire car. But the moment Claire walked in, everything else faded. She didn't wear the intimidating suit today, just a navy blouse and slacks, no makeup, and a tired but genuine smile. She motioned for him to follow her into a quiet conference room. "Mr. Torres," she said, folding her arms gently. "Thank you for coming." Of course, David replied, still unsure whether to sit or stand. Claire gestured to the seat across from her. He sat. "I'm not going to bury the lead," she said. "You've been recommended by multiple staff for the open night crew supervisor position. That's not common. Most hires come from within." David tried to find words. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll consider it," Claire said. Then after a pause, "And if it helps, it comes with benefits. Medical dental. For dependents, too." David exhaled slowly, the air shaky in his lungs. "Look," he said, his voice quieter now, "I've worked hard my whole life. Not always smart, maybe, but always hard. I've cleaned hospitals after night shifts, repaired heating units in 100-degree basements, mopped up messes no one talks about. But I've never felt like anyone was watching. Like it mattered." Claire didn't blink. "It did," she said. "And it does." Then she reached under the table and slid over a red folder. Inside, neatly printed on cream paper, was a file labeled Torres David Observation and Recommendation Notes, initiated by Claire Hartwell. David stared at it. "You've been watching me?" he asked, not with fear, but confusion. "Not spying," Claire said. "Observing. Ever since that night outside Rexton. You probably didn't see me. I was leaving late. You were walking away with your daughter holding her like she was glass and lightning at once." David's throat tightened. Claire continued, "I followed you, not to interfere, just to remember. Because a long time ago, someone watched me walk home from a janitorial shift with my little brother asleep on my back. Someone believed in me before I could spell the word ambition, and I never got to pay that forward." David sat back in stunned silence. "You're offering me this job because I remind you of you?" he asked softly. Claire shook her head. "I'm offering it to you because you've earned it." The resemblance. "That's just the part that makes me need to." The room held its breath between them. "I won't let you down," David said. "I know." That night, David didn't tell Lena everything just that he might be getting a promotion. She jumped into his arms and made him pinky promise that if he became a boss, he wouldn't be too serious to still make pancakes in funny shapes. He promised. And when she fell asleep on their mattress curled against a stuffed bear missing one eye, David sat quietly at the edge of the bed, rereading the letter from Claire and the observation notes again and again. The kindness that had shadowed him wasn't luck, it was choice, and it had a face now. At work, things changed quickly. Supervising 3 buildings wasn't easy. The staff varied wildly. Young people juggling 2 jobs, retired veterans trying to stay active, single mothers who clocked in after putting their kids to sleep. David saw them all, understood them. He implemented rotating shifts to help parents get home early. He arranged weekend potlucks on site to ease the loneliness night workers often carried. He kept a locked drawer filled with extra baby wipes, granola bars, and dollar store socks. People started calling it the kindness drawer. Claire stopped by once a week. She never stayed long, just walked the floors, greeted staff, left handwritten thank you notes tucked into lockers. David noticed every gesture. So did others. One day, weeks later, he found a note in his locker. "You changed the way this place feels. You made me believe it wasn't just about work, but about being seen. Thank you for giving us that." It wasn't signed. He didn't need it to be. Kindness didn't always wear a name tag. And sometimes the most powerful transformations start not with grand gestures, but with someone quietly noticing and then choosing not to walk away. David folded the note, carefully slipped it into the same red folder Claire had once given him. He labeled the folder, now Kindness File, and in it he started collecting more than papers. He collected every quiet reminder that even in a world that often looked away, someone watching with empathy can change everything. The first time David brought Lena to the main building after being officially promoted, she held his hand tighter than usual. The sun had just started rising behind the high-rises of downtown, casting long, gold-tipped shadows across the pavement. For the first time in weeks, the morning didn't feel like a finish line. It felt like a beginning. "Are we allowed to go in the front door now?" Lena whispered, eyeing the revolving glass entrance. David grinned. "Guess we are." As they walked inside, David noticed the receptionist, the same one who had once glanced at him like he didn't belong, now offering Lena a sticker with a warm smile. A butterfly. Lena placed it proudly on her tiny jacket. Claire was waiting near the elevator. She wasn't wearing a suit. Instead, a simple cardigan and dark jeans made her look less like an executive and more like someone's thoughtful older sister. The look on her face when she saw Lena was the softest David had ever seen from her. "Good morning," she said to both of them. Lena hesitated, then reached into her pocket and handed Claire a folded piece of paper. "I made you a picture. It's you, me, and Daddy. You're smiling." Claire unfolded it, 3 stick figures all holding hands under what looked like a huge yellow sun and a tall building with a heart on top. Claire blinked quickly, then smiled. "Thank you, Lena. This is perfect." She crouched beside the girl and whispered something David couldn't hear. Lena nodded solemnly, then skipped off toward the break room, humming. Claire rose. "She's beautiful. She's my whole world," David said, watching her go. There was a pause before Claire spoke again. "You know, we don't often get a chance to rewrite the stories we come from. But sometimes life gives us a pen again." David nodded slowly. And a clean page. The following weeks passed in a blur of purposeful motion. David dove into the role with quiet determination, building bridges between departments, listening more than he spoke, and always leading by example. He wasn't trying to climb any ladder, he just wanted to make the floor solid for others to stand on. One afternoon, he found a newer janitor, Michael, barely 19, asleep beside a supply closet, clearly exhausted. David didn't yell. Instead, he sat down beside him and asked him what was going on. Michael's eyes welled up. "My mom's in chemo. I'm working nights here and delivering food during the day. I'm trying, but I'm so tired." David helped adjust his schedule to something humane, started a quiet donation pool among the staff, and gave the boy a ride home when he didn't have one. It wasn't charity. It was what someone once did for him in their own way. And in the background of it all, Claire kept appearing. Always just when he didn't expect her, offering a cup of coffee, dropping by with notes, sometimes just watching from the back during a staff meeting. She never brought up her past, never explained more. But one Friday night, everything shifted. It started with a phone call. David was finishing paperwork when the security desk rang through. "Mr. Torres, there's a woman asking for you. Says it's personal." Confused, David made his way down and found Claire standing by the lobby window staring out into the rain. She looked different. Vulnerable, somehow. "I didn't know where else to go," she said. David walked closer. "Are you okay?" Claire didn't answer right away. She stared out at the storm for another moment before turning to face him. "My father was a janitor," she said, "single parent. We used to clean office buildings just like this at night. I did homework in the supply closets. Ate dinner from vending machines. I hated the smell of bleach because it meant we'd be here until 2 a.m. David stood silently. "He lost jobs because of me," she continued. "One night I fell asleep under a desk in an executive suite. A man found me and told my father we were a liability. He was fired the next morning." David's breath caught. "I remember standing in the rain that day," Claire said, voice tight, holding my dad's hand, thinking, if I ever got powerful enough I'd find people like him, like me, and do it differently. David exhaled slowly. "You were that kid." Claire nodded. "I was." The rain drummed harder against the glass. "I saw you that night outside Rexton," she added. "You didn't see me, but the way you held your daughter. I remembered my father's hands, calloused, gentle, always holding me like I was the only thing keeping him standing." David swallowed hard. He had no words, just the ache in his chest that told him something sacred had just been shared. Claire stepped closer. "I didn't help you out of pity, David," she said. "I helped because someone once gave me a chance when the world didn't, and I've been looking for the right person to pay that forward to." She looked away, then smiled softly. "Turns out..." He was already holding the mop. That night, David walked home in the rain with Lena sleeping against his shoulder, her cheek pressed to his collarbone. His jacket was soaked, his shoes squished with each step. But he didn't care, because for the first time in a long time he wasn't walking into the dark. He was walking toward something. And behind him, far above, a light remained on in Claire's corner office, not because anyone forgot, but because someone was still watching. Still believing, still remembering what it means to hold the hand of someone you once were, and never, ever let go. Claire stood in front of the long, narrow window of her office, staring down at the street below. The city buzzed in its usual rhythm, cars inching forward, umbrellas blooming under the drizzle, and people weaving between sidewalk puddles like they had somewhere better to be. But her eyes weren't on the crowd. They were searching for one figure, a man in a worn jacket and a little girl with a bounce in her step. When she finally spotted them, something in her chest eased. She watched as David lifted Lena into his arms just to avoid a puddle and carried her the rest of the way with a laugh that echoed through the glass. Claire's hand slowly lowered the blinds. Still watching came a voice behind her. It was Dolores, her longtime assistant and only real confidant in the office. Claire turned. "Habit, I guess." Dolores smiled knowingly and walked in, placing a folder on the desk. "This is more than habit, Claire." Claire didn't answer. She sat, glancing down at the folder, Community Programs Internal Staff Uplift Proposal. The draft David had worked on after hours, building on his idea to formalize support systems for night shift employees, rotating childcare hours, food assistance referrals, even optional mentorships. "What do you see in him?" Dolores asked gently. Claire looked up. "Everything I once needed." Dolores paused. "You ever think he might need more than just a professional opportunity?" Claire's gaze dropped to the folder again. Her voice softened. "I think he needs someone who doesn't walk away." Downstairs, David moved through the janitorial wing like someone who finally knew where he belonged. He checked timesheets, replaced a faulty supply scanner, and even fixed a broken coffee machine with a paperclip and a prayer. He didn't know why Claire's confession had stayed with him so deeply, But every time he looked at her now, he didn't just see the CEO who had offered him a job. He saw the girl who had once stood in the rain holding her father's hand and built an empire from that memory. But something inside him kept whispering, "Don't get too close." It wasn't fear, it was survival. He'd spent so many years making sure Lena had everything she needed, even when that meant keeping the world out. Love was a luxury. Trust was a risk. But then Claire had looked at him not like a boss, not like a benefactor, but like an equal, a kindred soul. And David didn't know what to do with that. Later that night, after Lena had gone to bed, snuggled into her blanket fort with her drawing book and a flashlight, David sat at the kitchen table staring at the proposal he'd written. His handwriting was still rough around the edges, but the ideas were solid, real, needed. He glanced across the room where Lena's backpack lay open, crayons spilling out like confetti. One drawing caught his eye. 3 figures again, this time under a tree. The same 3 stick people, but this time Claire had a crown. David chuckled under his breath. She was royalty to Lena the Queen, who saved their castle. And maybe, just maybe, something more to him, too. The next morning, David arrived at work early to finalize logistics for a Saturday cleanup event he'd volunteered to organize, a way to get staff involved with the community while earning bonus hours. But when he reached the bulletin board, something stopped him cold. Pinned there under the event flyer was a smaller sheet of paper. Typed, "Clean, quiet. Meet me on the rooftop at 6:15 p.m. C.H." His stomach flipped. At 6:13, he was already waiting, heart-racing hands jammed into his coat pockets. The rooftop was quiet, a small urban garden nestled behind solar panels and HVAC units, one of those hidden perks executives never talked about. Claire arrived 2 minutes later, hair pulled back, coat flaring behind her in the soft evening wind. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she walked to the railing and looked out. David joined her in silence. Then, softly, she asked, "What's the scariest thing you've had to face as a father?" David didn't hesitate. "Failing her." Claire nodded slowly. "Same." He turned to her, confused. "My brother," she said. "I raised him after our father died. He was 12. I was barely out of college. I wasn't ready, but I had no choice." Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the weight of years she rarely spoke of. "I missed parent-teacher meetings. I forgot birthdays. I buried myself in work because I didn't know how to be everything he needed." David said nothing. He knew that kind of guilt. The kind that didn't raise its voice, just stayed quietly in the background, reminding you could have done better. Claire turned to him. "I see the way you are with Lena. How she laughs louder when you're near. How she looks for your face before she does anything new. You're not failing her, David. You're giving her a story she'll carry into every room she ever walks into." David's throat tightened. And then she stepped closer. "I'm not asking for anything from you," she said. "Not out of gratitude. Not because I offered you a job. But if there's space in your life, not just as a father or as an employee, but as a man, I'd like to stand in that space." David looked at her, truly looked. He saw the rain-soaked girl, the iron-willed executive, the woman who had reached back in time, not just to pull someone forward, but to meet them where they stood. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the invisible thread between 2 people who had spent years trying to protect others and maybe finally found someone who could protect them too. He didn't answer with words. Just reached out and gently took her hand. And for once, neither of them had to be strong alone. The following Monday began like any other. Lena had insisted on wearing her lucky shoes, a pair of pink sneakers that lit up when she walked. David chuckled as he knelt to tie the laces. "You know you're going to blind someone in the elevator, right?" She grinned. "Then they'll be happy. Lights make people smile." He couldn't argue with that logic. At work, Claire was already in motion, navigating a gauntlet of meetings and internal strategy sessions. She wore that usual poise of hers, but there was a softness under it now, like someone walking through the world, not just thinking about numbers, but about hearts. She glanced out the window more than once that morning, and each time she hoped the man with the warm eyes and quiet strength would glance up too. At 10:47 a.m. everything changed. A fire alarm blared from the east wing of the building. People spilled from conference rooms and cubicles, confused but not panicked. Protocol was followed: orderly exits, head counts, safety checks. David had been on the third floor inspecting new mop inventory when he heard the alert. Within seconds, he'd slung his radio over his shoulder and moved toward the stairwell. By the time he reached the second-floor hallway, the smoke detectors had gone off and a shrill cry rose above the din. A child's cry. He knew instantly. Lena. Backtracking through the thinning hallway, he found her near the admin daycare center, pressed against the wall, eyes wide with fear. The daycare staff had already evacuated, but somehow Lena had darted back in looking for her crayon box. "Daddy," she cried, arms outstretched. Without a word, he scooped her up and shielded her face with his jacket. Smoke was beginning to creep from one of the side storage rooms, just a wiring short, he guessed, but enough to cloud vision and panic the senses. He moved quickly, years of janitorial familiarity guiding his steps, knowing which hallways dead-ended and which ones doubled as emergency exits. When he burst through the east stairwell, Lena clinging to him like a koala, a wave of relief swept over him until he heard a voice yell from above. "There's still someone on 5." Instinct kicked in. David passed Lena to a waiting security officer and turned back without hesitation. The building's upper floors weren't in flames yet, but every second counted. Claire had been coordinating with emergency response teams outside when she saw David disappear back into the building. "No," she shouted, but it was too late. People saw her expression change. The calm corporate executive now looked like someone whose entire world had just walked back into danger. 15 minutes crawled by, then 20. A few smoke-touched employees stumbled out, a shaken intern, a coughing maintenance worker, but no David. Claire stood frozen. Every memory, every quiet moment they'd shared replayed in her mind like still frames from a reel that might end too soon. And then the doors burst open. David emerged, soot-streaked shirt torn at the shoulder, carrying an older employee, Janine, the accounts payable lead, in his arms. The crowd gasped. Claire didn't. She exhaled finally, and her hand went to her mouth, eyes filling. He laid Janine gently on the paramedic stretcher and turned, expecting silence. Instead, the crowd applauded. It wasn't loud, it wasn't orchestrated, but it was real. That afternoon, the office buzzed in a way it hadn't in years. No one was talking about deadlines or stock options. They were talking about the janitor who ran back into a building for someone who wasn't his daughter, someone he barely knew. They were talking about David Torres. By 3 p.m., someone had posted a photo of the moment he carried Janine out, snapped by an intern. By 6 p.m., it had gone viral within the company intranet, captioned, "Sometimes the strongest ones wear aprons, not suits." Claire printed the image and quietly slipped it into a folder labeled Future Leadership. That evening, David sat on the worn couch in his apartment, arms wrapped around Lena, who had fallen asleep mid-cartoon. Claire stood at the open door. "You didn't have to go back in," she said softly. "I couldn't not go," he replied. "That's somebody's mom. Somebody's everything." She stepped closer. "You didn't just save her, David. You reminded people what real leadership looks like." He looked away. "I'm just a janitor." "No," she said, her voice low but sure. "You're the kind of person I want this company to be proud of. And the kind I—" She stopped herself. David met her eyes, and this time it wasn't a silent understanding. It was a confession neither of them needed to complete. That night, long after Lena had been tucked in and the city's lights shimmered like stars spilled across asphalt, David stepped onto his tiny balcony. Claire joined him, holding 2 mugs of tea. The world still spun, but in that moment, for once, it didn't feel like it was spinning without them. They stood shoulder to shoulder, 2 people who had carried more than their share of weight, and finally found someone to carry it with, because sometimes the heroes weren't in capes or corner offices. Sometimes they were the ones with calloused hands and soft hearts, and sometimes the world noticed just in time. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the east-facing windows of the office building, painting golden streaks across the marble floor. The lobby buzzed with whispers not of deals or deadlines, but of David. People who had never noticed him before now offered nod smiles, even coffee. Some clapped him on the back as he passed. The same uniform he wore every day now seemed to carry weight, not invisibility. But David remained quiet, polite, grateful, humble. His only concern that morning had been Lena's scraped knee from the chaos the day before. She was fine, bandaged, and smiling. But it reminded him how fragile things still were. One misstep, one accident, and everything could change. That's why when Claire's assistant told him she wanted to see him in her office, his gut twisted. Now he asked. She said she cleared her schedule. That wasn't normal. Claire stood by her window again when he entered, but this time she didn't wait for him to speak. She turned immediately and handed him a folder. Her eyes searched his. David opened it slowly. At the top was a letter, embossed with the company's logo. Offer of promotion. Director of Facilities and Community Engagement. He blinked, scanned the page again. His salary tripled. Benefits extended. Child care support. A private office. And below that, a note in Claire's own handwriting. I believe in what you're building. I want the world to see it. He looked up, stunned. Claire, I'm not. You are, she interrupted, gently but firmly. You don't see it yet, but everyone else does. The janitor who stepped up and carried someone from the fire. That wasn't luck. That was you. The man who stayed late, submitted proposals, remembered every face and name in this building. That's you. David's throat tightened. I never finished college, he said quietly. I've never led a team. I don't wear a suit. Claire stepped forward. Neither did my father. She said, her voice softer now. But he led me through the darkest years of my life. And when he died, I spent every day trying to become someone he would have been proud of. You remind me of him. David looked away, overwhelmed. Why me, Claire? Why now? There was a long pause before she spoke again. Because I was that kid. He froze. She walked past her desk, lifted a photograph from her bookshelf and handed it to him. A faded image, a little girl no older than Lena holding hands with a man in a janitor's uniform. Both were drenched in rain, but they were laughing. Behind them, a small building with a flickering neon sign, Mercy Diner. He used to take me there when we couldn't afford the heating bill. We'd share one plate of fries and he'd draw smiley faces in the ketchup. That's how I remember feeling safe. Her voice caught slightly. He brought me to work with him once when I was sick. His boss saw us and fired him on the spot. David's eyes widened. Claire nodded. We spent 3 nights in a motel after that using coins he'd saved in a jar labeled Hope. Her voice steadied again. When I saw you that day carrying Lena rushing to explain yourself to security, I didn't see an employee. I saw him. I saw me. I followed you that afternoon. I watched you leave that building with dignity, even when it hurt. And I knew I had to find a way to make it right, not just for you, but for every kid like I was. David looked at her speechless. His chest felt tight with a mix of awe, emotion, and something else rising, slowly recognition. Claire continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to tell you sooner, but I needed you to know you earned this on your own. The silence between them was full, but not heavy. David set the photo down. You didn't just make it right, Claire. You made it matter. They stood there for a long moment. No titles, no walls, just 2 souls who'd carried pain in different shapes and had somehow met in the middle. Then Claire smiled gently. So, Director Torres, shall we change a few things together? He chuckled softly. Only if I get to bring my tool belt. That night, David sat with Lena on the edge of her bed. She was coloring again, this time with new markers Claire had sent as a surprise. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to her drawing. She held it up proudly. A picture of their apartment, but brighter. Flowers in the window. 3 stick figures again, her David. And Claire now holding both their hands. "She's happy," Lena said, as if narrating for a stranger. "Because she's not alone anymore." David kissed the top of her head. "Neither are we, sweetheart." Across town, Claire stood on her own balcony, staring at the stars. For the first time in years, she felt like her father would be proud not just of what she'd built, but of how she was building it now. Her phone buzzed. A message from David. "Thank you. For everything. For seeing us." She typed back slowly, carefully. "I didn't just see you. I recognized you." She paused, then added, "And I'm not walking away." In the stillness of the night, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of healing beginning to take root. A janitor no more. A girl no longer waiting. A company about to be led not just by strategy, but by compassion. And at the center of it all, one man, one child, and one woman who had once been that kid, who now held the power to rewrite what dignity and leadership looked like together. The day David officially started as Director of Facilities and Community Engagement. He arrived in the same uniform he'd worn for the past 3 years, creased khakis, steel-toed boots, and a plain button-down shirt. But something in his posture had shifted. His shoulders were straighter, his steps quieter but more certain. He wasn't there to play a part. He was there to be one. Claire met him by the elevator on the executive floor. No grand announcement, no staged photo op, just a quiet nod and a smile that said, "This is exactly where you're meant to be." "You sure about this title?" David had asked her once. "It's a mouthful." Claire had smiled. "You're not just running facilities anymore, David. You're rebuilding how people feel when they walk through those doors." By noon, the shift had already begun. He sat in on a departmental meeting where junior staff actually spoke voices, trembling at first, then growing stronger as he nodded and jotted notes. When someone brought up a broken AC vent that had been ignored for months, he didn't deflect. He pulled out his phone, typed it into a work order system, and said, "We'll handle this by end of day. You have my word." A stunned silence, then applause. Not because the AC would be fixed, but because someone listened. Later that week, David launched a new initiative, Humans First. A series of employee-led lunches, anonymous feedback boxes, and monthly spotlight stories to highlight overlooked team members, cafeteria staff, security guards, mailroom workers. It was Claire's idea originally, but it was David who brought it to life. He called the first meeting himself, inviting a dozen employees from across departments. At the center of the table sat Lena's old teddy bear dressed in a tiny paper name tag, Hope. The room chuckled, but they also listened. And for the first time in years, people looked at each other not through titles but through stories. David's transformation didn't come without challenges. Some executives raised eyebrows behind closed doors. A janitor in a leadership meeting. Does he even have a college degree? Is this diversity, or just pity in disguise? Claire shut it down. In one boardroom during a particularly tense quarterly review, an older VP questioned David's qualifications. Claire leaned forward, locking eyes with the man. "Tell me," she said coolly, "when was the last time you carried someone out of a burning building?" The room fell silent. David didn't gloat. He never had. He simply leaned in and said, "I'm not here to impress anyone. I'm here to make sure the next person who walks in with a dream doesn't leave feeling invisible." That was the moment the tide turned. Outside the office, life changed too. Lena thrived in her new school. She had friends, now art supplies that weren't shared from a public bin, and teachers who called her bright, not behind. David picked her up every day at 3:15 sharp, sometimes with a smoothie, sometimes with news about a leaky pipe he'd fixed, but always with a smile. Claire came by some afternoons, usually with a second smoothie, and Lena, without asking, always offered her the first sip. One Friday evening, David invited Claire and her assistant to dinner at a small restaurant tucked between 2 laundromats. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. A place Lena called our victory spot. They ordered fries, shared stories, and laughed over spilled ketchup. Then Lena, ever observant, turned to Claire and said, "You don't wear heels when you're with us." Claire looked down at her simple flats, then back at the little girl. "Guess I don't need them here," she said. David chuckled. "She's got a way of stripping down your walls." Claire's eyes met his. "I think that's exactly what I needed." Later that night, as David walked Claire to her car, the air warm, and still he paused. "You know," he said, voice low, "I used to think love was for people who had time for it, who didn't have to worry about rent or lunch money, or if their kid would get teased for second-hand shoes." Claire turned slowly, and now he exhaled. "Now I think maybe love is for the ones who never stopped showing up anyway." She stepped closer, even if they're covered in mop water and drywall dust. He grinned, especially then. They didn't kiss, not yet, but as she reached for his hand and he let her, something quieter, deeper passed between them. Respect, recognition, and hope. Back at home, Lena had left a drawing on the fridge. 3 figures again, this time with a heart over their heads, and in big, colorful letters, "Sometimes families aren't found. They're made." David stared at it long after Lena had gone to sleep, and he realized maybe this wasn't just a new chapter. Maybe this was the book he'd always wanted to write now with someone who knew the pages before he ever turned them. Because love wasn't about timing. It was about presence, about the people who saw you when you were invisible, and chose to stay. It had been exactly 1 year since that morning, since the security guard's raised hand, since the quiet shame of walking out with his daughter in his arms and the cruel finality of the word terminated. And yet, standing at the front of the community room now wearing a button-down shirt that Lena had chosen, hair trimmed slightly better, and heart steady, David Torres didn't feel like the man who once begged for a second chance. He felt like the man who gave them. The walls around him buzzed with life staff from every department, their families, retired employees, even a few new hires who had heard the janitor's story and come just to see if it was true. Claire stood by the doorway, leaning against the frame, a soft smile playing on her lips. Lena sat cross-legged in the front row, a paper sign taped to her chest that read, "My dad's the boss," and "My hero." The room quieted as David stepped to the small podium. No mic, no teleprompter, just a simple note card in his hand and a heart too full to hide. He cleared his throat. "I'm not gonna lie. I've stood in this building soaked in rain, covered in bleach once with gum on my shoe and once with a sandwich stuck in my back pocket. But today I stand in gratitude." Laughter rippled softly. David glanced at Claire. Her eyes were on him, steady, proud. "I used to believe that people like me didn't belong in places like this. That once the world labels you maintenance or just a dad, you keep your head down and stay out of the way. But then something happened. Something small. Something big. All at once." He looked toward Lena. "Someone believed in me." His voice cracked just enough to make every person in the room lean forward. "I wasn't given this role because I wore the right tie or had the perfect resume. I was given it because someone saw the kind of leader who doesn't leave, who stays when the hallway floods, who shows up after they're told not to, who holds a child's hand tighter when everything's falling apart." He folded the card and put it in his pocket. "And today, if I can leave you with anything, it's this: we all carry keys. Not just to open doors for ourselves, but to unlock someone else's future. You may never know the weight a smile lifts, or how far a kind word carries. But believe me, sometimes that's the miracle." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of hearts opening, of walls falling, of seeds being planted. Claire was the first to stand. The room followed one by one until everyone was on their feet. No music played, no confetti dropped. But it didn't need to. This was a standing ovation, not for a title but for a life rebuilt one choice at a time. That night, David and Claire sat outside the modest brownstone he now called home, one he'd bought with his first bonus, not because it was flashy, but because it had a porch where Lena could paint sunsets. The summer air was soft, filled with fireflies and the faint hum of distant laughter from neighboring yards. Claire held a glass of sweet tea in one hand, her other wrapped around David's. He broke the silence first. "Do you ever think about that day? The fire alarm, the chaos security pushing me out?" She nodded slowly. "I think about what would have happened if I'd walked away." He looked at her. "But you didn't." "No," she said gently, "because I knew what it felt like to be you, and I knew what it meant to be seen." They were quiet a moment more. Then she leaned her head on his shoulder. "David, I think I love your daughter's drawings more than any painting I've ever bought." He smiled. "That's good, because there's a whole stack of family portraits she's planning to hang in your apartment." Claire chuckled softly. "She already assigned me a favorite color and a superhero nickname. She told me, David said, 'You're Captain Calm.'" She laughed again, an easy, full sound that made something settle inside him. Not excitement, not butterflies. Something truer. Peace. Inside, Lena had fallen asleep on the couch, arms wrapped around a pillow shaped like a golden star. Her bedtime book, The Invisible Boy, lay open beside her. She had underlined a line in pencil, even though she knew she wasn't supposed to write in books, "When someone sees you, you're not invisible anymore." David knelt beside her and kissed her forehead, then gently lifted her in his arms and carried her to bed. As he pulled the blanket over her and turned off the light, he hesitated, then turned it back on. Just the small nightlight shaped like a moon. He left it glowing. Not because she was afraid of the dark, but because she wasn't anymore. As David stepped back outside, Claire reached for his hand again. "What made you leave it on?" she asked. He smiled. "Because sometimes we don't just need to be seen once. We need someone to keep the light on until we can find the switch ourselves." She nodded, eyes glistening. Then slowly she leaned in. And this time, finally they kissed. Not as boss and employee. Not even as two people healing, but as two lights left on for each other. In the distance, the city moved as it always had. But for David, Claire, and Lena, something had shifted forever. Not in noise, but in hope. Because love, when born from kindness, doesn't just change a story. It rewrites the ending. Sometimes the people who save us don't raise their voice. They just raise an umbrella. And sometimes the most unexpected love grows from a single act of silent grace. That's what happened here in the story of a man who was fired for bringing his little girl to work, and a woman who saw herself in that child, because once she was that kid. What would you have done in Maya's place, or Jake's? Have you ever crossed paths with someone who reminded you of your younger self? Someone you just couldn't walk away from? Let us know where you're watching from, and what part of this story touched you most. And if you believe the world needs more stories like this, subscribe to join a growing community that believes in love, kindness, and second chances. Thank you for watching. We'll be here with the light on.